Something is happening right now that is going to affect your rent, your grocery bill, your loan payment, and the interest rate on every debt you carry. And most people have no idea the mechanism is already running. Day 14 of the US and Israel war on Iran. For 2 weeks, the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile stretch of water between Iran and Oman, has been effectively closed. 20% of the world's oil supply is not moving. And today, Iran's new supreme leader made his first public address since taking power. He had one message: the strait stays closed. His exact words: the Strait of Hormuz must remain closed as a tool of pressure, not a threat, a declared policy. Yesterday, governments tried 2 things to stop what is coming. The largest emergency oil reserve release in history, 400 million barrels. And then Washington went further, a sanctions waiver on Russian oil stranded at sea, adding another 100 million barrels to global supply. 2 historic interventions in a single day. Oil went up anyway. It is above $101 this morning. When the 2 biggest government interventions in oil market history cannot move prices on the day they are announced, that is the moment to stop watching the price and start understanding what it is connected to. Because what is heading toward your wallet right now is not just an oil spike. It is an inflation shock, an interest rate shock, and a debt shock, all running simultaneously through every layer of the financial system. And the historical record of what that combination does to ordinary people is something nobody is explaining clearly enough. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how a closed waterway transmits economic pain through the entire financial system until it reaches your bank account. I'm going to show you the historical playbook, because this mechanism has run before, and every time it ran, the damage was worse than anyone predicted while it was happening. And I am going to give you 4 signals that tell you how deep this goes. Not what politicians are saying, but what the financial system itself is telling us right now. Stay until the end. Before I get into the mechanics, I need to show you something that happened this week, because it reveals exactly how disconnected the official narrative is from what is actually happening in the economy. On Tuesday, oil prices fell more than 11% in a single day. Trump said the war would be over very soon. Saudi Aramco announced it would ramp up crude flows through its pipeline, resuming about 70% of its usual shipments. For a few hours, it looked like this was resolving fast. Prices collapsed. Then something extraordinary happened. The U.S. Secretary of Energy posted on social media that the U.S. Navy had escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Energy prices moved instantly across the globe. Then the White House press secretary went to the podium and said, "The U.S. Navy has not escorted a tanker or a vessel at this time." The post was deleted. It was wrong. Billions of dollars in economic value had moved on a social media post that turned out to be false. And then Iran launched what it called its most intense operation since the war began. 3 vessels struck. Drones near Dubai airport. Oil reversed. 2 tankers caught fire in Iraqi waters. The first time in this conflict that Iran struck inside Iraqi territorial waters. Iraq's ports stopped completely, and oil crossed back above $100. Here's what all of that tells you. The economic shock being built right now is not being driven by a clean, readable situation. It is being driven by chaos, by tweets, by deleted posts, by Trump saying, "very soon," by a new supreme leader's first statement. Every headline swings energy prices 10% in either direction. And every time prices swing, the economic pain transmitting through supply chains, through inflation, through interest rates, gets harder to stop. The U.S. Pentagon and National Security Council have now privately acknowledged that they underestimated Iran's willingness to close the strait. That is, the U.S. government admitting the core assumption behind the entire operation was wrong. And when the assumption was wrong, everything built on top of it is wrong too. That is where we are on day 14. And everything I am about to show you flows from that single fact. Let me show you the number that nobody is doing the math on correctly. 20 million barrels per day. That is how much oil is not moving right now. 15 million barrels of crude, plus 5 million barrels of other petroleum products. Every single day, sitting in tankers, anchored at the edge of a waterway that no commercial crew will cross. That number comes from the IEA's own emergency report, published this week. Now, here is what 400 million barrels means against that number. 400 million divided by 20 million per day. That is 20 days. The largest emergency reserve release in the history of the global oil market buys 20 days of coverage, and that assumes every barrel reaches refineries instantly, which it does not. It takes weeks to physically move strategic reserves from storage to market. Run the math the way the IEA ran it, accounting for delivery time. 400 million barrels covers 26 days. 26 days. And now Washington added the Russian waiver, 100 million barrels of Russian oil currently at sea, freed up for global markets. Run that same math, 100 million divided by 20 million per day. 5 more days. So the combined total of the largest emergency reserve release in history, plus a historic sanctions waiver on Russian oil, buys 31 days. 31 days against a disruption that Iran's new supreme leader just declared Today will continue indefinitely. Look at what happened when governments announced both interventions. Prices went up anyway, not down. Up. Because the economy ran the same math I just showed you and reached the same conclusion. Here is what is happening in the Gulf right now. Gulf producers, Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, are still producing oil. The wells are running, but the oil has nowhere to go. It piles up in storage, tanks fill up, and when storage is full, producers start shutting in production, cutting output not because they want to, but because they physically cannot store anymore. Gulf countries have already cut at least 10 million barrels per day of production. Not a cartel decision, not a policy choice. They ran out of places to put it. And here's the part that got almost no coverage. Even after the Strait reopens, production will take weeks, in some cases months, to return to pre-crisis levels. The damage being done right now extends beyond the closure itself. There is a recovery lag on the other side. Now here is the structural problem that makes this situation unlike anything that came before it. The entire architecture of the global oil market was built around one assumption, that if one producer goes down, others can compensate. Saudi Arabia holds spare capacity for exactly this scenario. OPEC was designed so that if one country goes offline, others open the taps. That architecture has one thing built into it that nobody questioned for decades, that the oil can be shipped. Right now, Saudi Arabia's spare capacity is sitting on the wrong side of a closed strait. The backup pipelines, the East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia, the UAE pipeline to Fujairah, cover a fraction of what the strait moves on a normal day. The safety net was never designed for a full closure. It was designed for disruption at the margins. The self-correcting mechanism that the global oil market relied on for 50 years just stopped working. And no reserve release, no Russian waiver, no presidential tweak can replace it. Nobody is saying that clearly enough. But the math is right there for anyone willing to run it. Welcome to Finance Deciphered. If you are new here, this is what we do. We decode the mechanism underneath the headline, the layer that actually determines what happens to your money. Every week this war continues. That gap between people who understand the mechanics and people who are just watching the news is going to widen. Hit subscribe and hit the notification bell right now so you do not miss the next update, because this story is moving fast. Now let me show you what these numbers are already doing to the global economy. Let me walk through what these numbers are already doing to the global economy, not what they might do, what they are doing right now, today. The day before this war started, Brent crude was trading at $73 a barrel. It hit nearly $120 earlier this week. It is sitting above $101 this morning. That is a move of nearly 40% in 2 weeks. U.S. crude posted its biggest weekly gain in the history of the futures contract, going back to 1983. The biggest weekly gain ever recorded. That is not a number that belongs in a normal market. Now here is what that price move is doing at street level. Before the war, U.S. gasoline was around $3 per gallon. This morning it is at $3.63, a 22% jump since the war began, and still rising as this week's crude prices work their way through the refining system. That transmission takes days to weeks to fully show up at the pump. The worst of this week's oil prices has not yet hit American drivers. Diesel is worse. Diesel is now at $4.89 per gallon. That is up 30% since the start of the war. And diesel is not just what trucks run on. It is what the entire physical supply chain runs on. When a 24% fuel surcharge automatically kicks in for every major freight carrier. Air, road, rail, the cost goes into every product those carriers move. Groceries, medicine, auto parts, construction materials. The oil shock is not just at the pump. It is moving through every physical supply chain in the economy simultaneously. The average 30-year fixed mortgage in the United States just hit 6.3%, the highest level since February. Not because the Federal Reserve raised rates, because bond markets are pricing in the inflation they know is coming. Your mortgage cost just went up because of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. In Asia, the situation is more acute. Japan announced a price cap on petrol. South Korea announced a price cap. Thailand announced a price cap. These are not symbolic gestures. These are governments burning fiscal resources to absorb an oil shock that their economies cannot sustain at market prices. Japan's stock market fell 1.2% this morning. South Korea fell 1.7%. These are two of the world's 10 largest economies, both moving in the wrong direction at the same time. And in Southeast Asia, people are already feeling it at street level. Long queues at petrol stations in the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. The Philippines, which gets 95% of its crude from the Gulf, announced a 4-day working week for government employees to conserve fuel. These are not emergency responses from governments that think this ends next week. Now here is where it connects to something much bigger than fuel costs. The U.S. Consumer Price Index for February came in at 2.4%. That number was measured before any of this hit. March is going to be a different number. Every analyst covering the Federal Reserve knows it, and markets are already repricing interest rate expectations as a result. At the start of 2026, markets were pricing in multiple Federal Reserve rate cuts this year. Right now, those same markets are pricing in one cut for the entire year. In Europe, the picture flipped entirely. The ECB was supposed to be cutting rates this year. Now markets are pricing the possibility that the ECB's next move is a hike, not a cut, possibly as soon as June. And in the UK, the Bank of England sits at 3.75% with 0 rate cuts now expected. Cuts that were supposed to support a British economy that just posted 0 GDP growth in January. When rates stay high or go higher because of oil-driven inflation, here is what happens to ordinary people. Mortgages cost more, business loans cost more, consumer credit costs more. Companies that borrowed cheaply to expand start laying off workers instead. And the economic growth that rate cuts were supposed to deliver, the relief that millions of households were waiting for, does not happen. All of it traces back to 20 million barrels per day, sitting on the wrong side of a 21-mile stretch of water. Pension funds, savings accounts, and retirement portfolios are already absorbing these losses, and the people who will feel that most are not traders. They are ordinary workers whose retirement depends on markets that are now pricing in a prolonged energy crisis. Now, let me show you something that changes how you read everything else in this story. Stop thinking about this as a military conflict with economic side effects. Start thinking about it as an economic conflict being fought through military means. Iran's military command announced explicitly that its strategy is to impose a prolonged economic shock on the world to force Washington to back down. That is not my interpretation. That is the stated objective, reported by every major wire service this week. Not a negotiated settlement, not a ceasefire, a prolonged economic shock. And look at how they are executing it. Any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies is a legitimate target. Every commercial tanker operator in the world heard that. No insurance underwriter will cover a crew through that strait under those conditions. The closure is not maintained by physical force alone. It is maintained by a credible threat that gets reaffirmed every time a new vessel burns. This week, 19 commercial ships have been damaged since the war began. Then look at this. Iran declared that banks are legitimate military targets and told civilians in the Middle East to stay 1,000 meters away from bank branches. 1,000 meters. As a direct result, Citibank shut its branches in the UAE. HSBC shut its branches in Qatar. Banks are not just where people put their money. They are the infrastructure of international trade. Letters of credit, trade finance, cross-border payments. When banks cannot safely operate in a region, the mechanisms that move oil, food, and goods between countries start freezing, independent of whether ships are moving or not. Now add what happened this week with Russia. Washington tried to ease the economic shock by lifting sanctions on Russian crude currently at sea. 100 million barrels freed for global supply. Prices went up anyway, because the economy knows that 100 million barrels covers 5 days against a 20 million barrel per day disruption with no end date. And the move had another consequence nobody is discussing. It handed Moscow a diplomatic win, created a fracture between Washington and its European allies, and put billions of additional dollars into the Russian energy budget while the war in Ukraine continues. Iran's strategy is to hold the economic threat in place long enough that the pressure becomes politically unsustainable for the United States. And every intervention Washington has tried this week, the reserve release, the Russian waiver, the fake naval escort post, has failed to change the fundamental equation. Almost nobody in mainstream financial coverage is framing it this way, but the evidence is sitting right there in the price of oil. Now let me show you the historical context. Because this mechanism has run before, and every time it has run, the sequence was the same. 1973, the Arab oil embargo. OPEC cut off exports to the United States and Western Europe after the Yom Kippur War. Prices quadrupled. Inflation hit double digits. The Federal Reserve tightened. The entire decade that followed was defined by stagflation. High inflation alongside economic stagnation at the same time. That disruption affected roughly 7% of global oil supply. 7%. What is blocked right now represents approximately 20% of global daily supply. Nearly 3 times the size of the shock that redefined the global economy for a decade. And energy analysts looking at the full picture have called this already the biggest oil supply disruption in recorded history, more than double the previous record, which was set during the Suez Crisis in 1956. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Production collapsed, prices doubled, the U.S. economy contracted. The Fed under Paul Volcker raised rates to 20% to kill the inflation. It worked, but it triggered one of the deepest recessions in post-war history. 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Oil surged nearly 70% in 3 months. Coalition forces went to war. Oil came back when Kuwait was liberated. But the price shock still contributed to the recession of 1990 and 1991. Same pattern every time. Supply shock. Inflation. Central banks caught between fighting prices and supporting growth, ordinary people paying through higher costs, higher rates, and slower economies. Now, here is what is different in 2026. In every previous shock, there was a clear path to resolution. The embargo ended through diplomacy. The revolution stabilized. Kuwait was liberated militarily in weeks. Today, Iran's new supreme leader just made his first public address and used it to declare the strait stays closed. Iran has publicly stated its conditions for ending the war: recognition of its rights, reparations, and international guarantees against future attacks. Washington has not engaged any of those conditions. There is no diplomatic channel visible to the public. There is no negotiating table. In previous shocks, other producers could compensate by opening their taps. Today, those same producers are cutting output because they cannot export. The backup mechanism does not work when the pipeline is blocked for everyone. And the central banks that would normally have room to respond, to cut rates, to stimulate, to absorb the shock, came into this crisis with rates already at restrictive levels. The Bank of England at 3.75%, the Fed above 4%, the ECB still in restrictive territory. There is no cushion. The historical pattern always resolved. But resolution always came with economic pain first. The question in 2026 is not whether the pattern resolves, it is how much of that pain gets transmitted into the global economy before it does. And right now, the transmission has only just begun. That is the part nobody's talking about because it is not visible in the price today. It shows up in the data 3 to 6 months from now. Let me be precise about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying oil hits $200. That threat was made. But threats and outcomes are different things. I'm not saying the global economy enters recession next quarter. I'm not saying banks fail or markets collapse. What I am saying is this: the mechanism connecting the Strait of Hormuz to your energy costs, your interest rate, and your purchasing power is running at full speed right now. It started running on February 28th. It is running harder today than it was yesterday, and the people who understand that mechanism clearly are going to make better decisions in the next 90 days than the people reacting to each individual headline. So here are the 4 signals. Not predictions, not things you need a Bloomberg terminal to track, things you can observe yourself in your daily life, in your local economy, and what governments around you start doing. Signal 1, the price at your gas station. Right now, gasoline is up 22% since the war began and still rising because the full impact of this week's oil prices has not yet worked through the refining system. When you see the pump price stop climbing and hold flat for a week, that is the first sign the energy shock is stabilizing, not resolved. Stabilizing. Watch the direction, not the number. Signal 2, what your central bank says next. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of England, all of them came into this crisis expecting to cut rates this year. Relief for mortgages, relief for business loans, relief for consumer debt. That relief is now on hold or reversed entirely because of oil-driven inflation. When central banks start talking about cuts again, not as a hope, but as a decision, that tells you the inflation wave from this shock has passed its peak. That is the signal the financial system has absorbed the damage. Signal 3, your grocery bill. Diesel is up 30% since the war began, and a 24% fuel surcharge is now automatically applied to every freight carrier in the country. That cost is moving into every product on every shelf. It takes 4 to 8 weeks to fully transmit from the fuel pump to the supermarket price. The worst of that transmission has not happened yet. When your weekly grocery cost stops rising, the supply chain has found its new floor. Signal 4, whether governments stop talking about military options and start talking publicly about negotiations, not diplomatic hints, not back channels, public statements about talks. Every previous oil shock ended when the political cost of continuing became higher than the political cost of negotiating. In 1973, it was Kissinger. In 1990, it was the coalition. Watch for the moment when a major government, any major government, says the word negotiations out loud on the record with Iran. That is the signal the political calculation has flipped. None of these 4 signals has moved in the right direction today. Fuel prices are still rising. Central banks have abandoned their rate cut plans. Grocery costs have not yet peaked, and there is no public negotiating channel. That is the honest read of where we are on day 14. Drop a comment. Tell me which of these 4 signals you are already seeing in your own life. Tell me if your grocery bill has moved. Tell me if your mortgage payment changed. Tell me what you're seeing on the ground. Because the most important data right now is not in any official report. It is in what ordinary people are experiencing right now in real time. I will pin the most detailed response. Share this video right now, because there are people in your life, business owners, people with mortgages, people making financial decisions this week, who are operating on the assumption that this resolves quickly. That assumption is not supported by what the data is showing today. This video gives them the mechanism to think about it clearly. And right now, understanding the mechanism is the most valuable thing anyone can have. This is Finance Deciphered. We do not chase the headline. We decode the layer underneath it, the mechanism that actually determines what happens to your money. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Because the next development in this story is not going to wait for you. This is Finance Deciphered. The mechanism is running. The 4 signals will tell you when it starts to slow. None of them are moving in the right direction today. Stay sharp.